So several years ago when I was working as a chaplain, I was sitting in the spiritual care unit of a Catholic hospital, and I got paged by a nurse who wanted me to go to a patient's room. Now, whenever a nurse paged me, I knew it meant trouble. Because when it came from a patient, it was one thing, but when it came from the nurse, it meant they tried everything and they weren't succeeding, and so chaplains were their next best bet. So I went up to the nurse's station, and sure enough, she was sitting there a bit wide-eyed, and she gestured toward the door, and she said, "Mother and daughter, Mom is supposed to have surgery," and they're screaming at the top of their lungs at each other. I said, okay. So I go and I open the door, and sure enough, there they are in this room. The daughter is standing, she's red-faced, she's yelling at her mom. The mom is frail and in the hospital gown, but she's up there in the bed and she's yelling right back at her daughter. And I'm thinking, what are they arguing about? What could they possibly be arguing about at this moment? And as I'm listening, I start to realize that what the daughter is saying, "Mom, you have to accept Jesus before you go into surgery." And the mother is saying, no, I will never accept Jesus. So eventually, the daughter sees me, and she looks relieved, and she's like, oh, Pastor, you're here. She says, I'm a born-again Christian. She said, and I've accepted Jesus Christ into my heart. My mom's going into surgery, and she will not accept Jesus, and I'm scared for her. And meanwhile, the mother's over here, and she's again saying, I will never accept Jesus into my heart. Never, never, never. I said, okay, let's all take a breath together. And then they start going at it with each other, and so finally, I say to the mother, I say, okay, your daughter seems really concerned about you. And can you tell me, what your take on all this is? And the mother, she says, I will never be born again. I will never accept Jesus Christ in my heart. She said, I am not a Christian. I am a lifelong Catholic. So meanwhile, this nun that worked in the spiritual care department had popped her head in the room. She hears the two of them going at it again, and she pops her head in the room, and she says to me, what's going on? I say, the mother is refusing to accept Jesus because she says she's not Christian, she's Catholic. And then nun said, oh my gosh, and she just stomped off. So this is funny, and also a little poignant, though, that at this moment, these two were arguing. They were actually on the same side and had no idea, and they were arguing in this very particular moment. It's actually symptomatic of something that is larger and more troublesome in the United States. And I think it was illustrated by the so-called Secretary of War. I don't know if you saw this. Supposedly was quoting a biblical verse, but it was actually a monologue from Pulp Fiction, the movie. And whether he knew what he was quoting or not, whether it was ignorance or not, the fact that we live in a country where people with such confidence assert knowledge that actually they don't have. And this is a problem. There's a man named Stephen Prothero who's written a few books on the subject, Religious Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know and Doesn't. And he says that we are one of the most religious nations in a lot of ways, and also one of the most religiously illiterate nations. And not only do people not know about other people's religion here in the United States, they don't know about their own. And that's a big, big problem. Because one of the things we're seeing on the national stage is Christian nationalism, the idea that we have administrators and leaders who are creating policy based on Christian ideas, but we can see that these folks don't even know what they're talking about necessarily. And this is something that is very concerning. So I think in these times, whether we like it or not, we need to be religiously literate. We need to be biblically literate, because if the Bible, the Christian Bible, is supposedly going to be used to create policy that affects all of us, we need to understand what that means and what the reality of the Bible, the Christian Bible, and what all of that actually looks like in context. So let's talk about that for a moment, because as our worship associate said, we're learned people in this room, but we all don't necessarily know how all of this came to be. And this could be a 3-hour lecture, but let's put it in a nutshell here for all of us. The first writings, the actual Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the narrative of Jesus' life that we find in today's Christian Bible, that did not come into being until about 35 to 65 years after Jesus, who we believe was probably a real historical figure, died. So what this is like in some ways is because there were texts, maybe some different documents circulating during this time with bits of information. There were verbal stories. There were people who were telling particular stories. Maybe they were eyewitnesses or friends of eyewitnesses. All that's happening until this is actually written down in the Gospels as we know them. But it would be kind of like today if the very first biography of John F. Kennedy came out. If all these years it had simply been people telling stories about his life and assassination, and maybe there were some written documents around, but it's the very first time right now, almost close to 70 years after his assassination, that story would come out in a written form. That is what we're talking about with that. So it wasn't until the end of the 4th century that people really decided, and I'm looking forward to this, I never get to just hold up a Bible in church. So it wasn't until the 4th century that this, as we know it today, was really solidified and accepted by people. And this happened because people in power looked at all the different documents that were floating all around. And you had some groups that were centering their faith around a particular document or book, and you had others using other texts, and these people in power looked at everything and then decided, here are the books that are going to be in the Bible. And even in our modern world, we have Christian churches that have some variations with this. If you go to the Ethiopian Christian church, you will find books in their Bible that are not in the standard Christian Bible. So the Book of Jubilees and the Book of Enoch are in the Ethiopian version of the Bible. So that didn't happen until the 4th century. And as so is often the case, it becomes a thing where people don't remember the process to get to that. They just remember the final result. So truth, even though it's a process that power decided upon, truth gets, people start getting complacent and just decide, that's the way it's always been. And that is not the way it's always been. Truth is shaped and then remembered as if it had always been fixed. And then when you remember something as always being fixed, you don't question it along the way. So what do we know then about some of these books that didn't make it into the Bible? And what do they tell us about those in power and what story they were trying to tell and what story people are still trying to tell? Well, over the years, some of those texts have surfaced. Like in 1945 in Egypt, in a place called Nag Hammadi. The guy's digging there in the sand, and he comes upon this giant earthenware jar that's been sealed. And get this, it's been sealed for 1,500 to 1,600 years. Inside of this jar, you have 13 scrolls that have over 50 books. Some of them are books we know, like Plato's Republic, and some of them are Gospels that never made it into the Bible, alternative Gospels that we've never seen or we haven't seen for maybe 1,000 years or more. And I want to tell you about two that came out of this earthenware jar in Nag Hammadi. The first one is the Gospel of Thomas. And this is fascinating because it's about Jesus, but it's not the narrative of his life. It is strictly one quotation after another. Things that he supposedly said that were written down 1,600 years ago. And these sayings present some really interesting information to us, because what they keep coming back to over and over is the idea that the kingdom, that God, is already within you. The kingdom, God, is already within you. And it goes even further than that. It says, in order to have salvation, to be saved, all you have to do is look within. Now, imagine people who are trying to create a formalized institution of the church. When they read this, they say, yeah, this ain't going in the Bible, right? Because it's not anything that you have to do externally. It's all about that you already have it within you. Now, also in this jar, we have the book of Mary. And this is not Mary, mother of Jesus. This is Mary Magdalene. And this is another fascinating book because you may know the character of Mary Magdalene from the Bible. She's in there as a companion to Jesus and somebody that's talked about in appreciative terms. But in this gospel, Mary is not just a disciple. She is the favored disciple. Above all the men, Mary is the one who is the wisest, the most favored. She is the one that Jesus takes aside at the beginning of this gospel, and he says, I am going to tell you some wisdom that I can't share with anybody else. I want you to hold this wisdom and you to pass it on. And then he goes on to tell her this wisdom, and we're missing those 4 pages where he does that, by the way. So then, after she gets the wisdom, because we're missing those 4 pages, she comes back to the male disciples and she tells them what's happened. And Peter, a very prestigious disciple, he says, wait a minute, Jesus is not going to tell a woman something first that he hasn't told us. This does not make any sense. I mean, should we really listen to this woman? I mean, this is exactly what he says in there. And another disciple says, well, if Jesus felt like she was the one to tell this to, then shouldn't we respect that? So, do I have to tell you why the church decided this gospel did not make it in the Bible? Clearly. And not only that, I mean, you've probably heard over the years, and there is no biblical text to support this, that Mary Magdalene was a sinner, perhaps formerly a prostitute, that had come to Jesus. There's no text that supports that. That was simply something that was said that we probably think was because they wanted to undermine Mary Magdalene's authority. Really fascinating stuff. So the third book I want to tell you about did not come out of that jar. It wasn't found until the 1970s. And this just goes to show that if you get digging, there might be more of these books somewhere in our backyards or something. But this is the book of Judas. And Judas, as you may know, is the character in the Bible, the disciple who betrays Jesus. And it leads to his crucifixion. And it even says in the Bible itself something about Satan coming into Judas and taking over, and so he does this terrible thing. But in the book of Judas, there's no mention of Satan. Jesus actually tells him, you have a really important and difficult role, and this is going to be hard, but it's part of a bigger story, and you're going to need to do this. So this villain from the Bible in this gospel is actually someone who is not betraying, but being obedient, who is actually part of an important story and playing his role in that story. And you can imagine, as these folks are sitting down trying to figure out what goes in the canonized Bible and what doesn't, they said, this is too complicated. The idea that good and evil, there's not this division here like we're trying to portray it, that it's more nuanced, it's more complicated, it's more layered. They're like, this book is out. So it was. And so all of these these books that did not make it in. And there's dozens more out there as well. Really, really interesting to learn about. All of these show us that power didn't just share truth. It decided what counted as truth. Power didn't just share truth. It decided what counted as truth. And then truth is shaped and then remembered as if it had always been that way. We're not even talking about translations and all the different versions of the Bible currently that are out there. But people remember it as a fixed thing. You know, I think in our own lives we've had those experiences where truth gets shaped and fixed, and we don't question it maybe until something happens. And I'm thinking about very early on when I was in elementary school, they had an experiment that they started when I was in first grade. They called it the Gifted and Talented program. And kids were divided into that program. And at the time, the narrative was, you know, these are the smart kids, right? These are the smart kids. And I look back now and I realize, oh, these were also the neurodivergent kids with ADHD, highly sensitive kids who maybe struggled a bit socially. That was a narrative, too, that we didn't talk about at that time. And as the years went by, this group of gifted kids stayed together in middle school and high school, and no one questioned that these were the smart kids, the gifted kids. And I'll never forget, we had taken the SATs, and the principal over the intercom announced whose scores were high enough on the SAT that they were now National Merit Scholars. And so I'm sitting in my advanced English class, and they start naming these National Merit Scholars and looking around the room like, yeah, of course her, and yeah, obviously him, and there's maybe 3 named, and then they named the 4th person, and we all went, who's that? Who's this girl that we don't even know? We've never even heard of her. And as we started to get to know about her, it turned out that she didn't come from the same neighborhoods that the folks in our gifted program came from. Now, we had racial diversity in that program and so on, but we all came from the same kind of neighborhood. The same kind of neighborhood. But this girl was actually part of a system at the time of busing kids across town from an area that was very different from where we were from. And I remember thinking, why don't we know her? And also, why have we been put in a particular box where we know some people and some people are part of our group and others aren't? And maybe I didn't even choose to be in this box. Maybe there's more or something different that I can be. And that was probably something, and I think maybe many of us are still working on that today, whatever box we might have been put in when we were younger, trying to figure out who we really are at our core, what our essence is really all about. It's something that we continue to work on because so often something powerful has told us what the truth is, but we've never really had the chance to examine what our truth is. You know, I think there really are truths. There are things like gravity, things like the facts like the body needs oxygen or that the earth orbits around the sun. These are truths. But because there is the human element there, truth often gets framed and interpreted and presented in a particular way. And when that truth is tied to power, it often becomes rigid. It becomes something that resists questioning. And we see this now with policies in our world where they're being shaped by narrow interpretations of Scripture, supposedly. And at Texas Tech University system this week, they came out with something that they're not going to allow teaching or discussion or anyone writing about anything LGBTQ related. And then, of course, we had the shooting last night at the correspondence dinner, and we're in this place where we see people in power who are sharing false narratives, and we don't even know what to trust anymore as real, what the truth may be. I think as you use, if we are going to resist Christian nationalism, we can't afford to be biblically literate. I hope I've armed you with a few facts today that you can use out in the world, at least to begin to help people to think about things. There's a lot of beauty and wisdom in the Christian scriptures, but it's important that it be understood contextually and that we don't allow people to take some of that and weaponize it or even just lie about what's in there altogether. Because misuse depends on ignorance, and ignorance can lead to us being vulnerable to those in power. So it's really important that we have a knowledge of how truth is shaped by power, that we really understand that. You know, truth and certainty are two different things, in my opinion. I think certainty is something that happens when we forget how truth was shaped to begin with. It becomes closed, and you can't question it. That's why we see people doubling down in our country, because they have to be certain, because they know that certainty will be shaken if it's allowed to question. But truth-seeking actually allows us to be curious. It allows us to be open. It allows us to be self-critical even and accountable for what we say and what we do. Truth ultimately is not something we possess. It's a process. It's a practice. We discern truth by noting power, paying attention to where harm is, and by investigating how an idea came to be in the first place. And when we practice that, it's an opportunity to change us as human beings, because it helps us to defend what we love when it's under attack, and it opens us up to possibilities for how we understand the world and ourselves. And that, my friends, is the truth. But don't take my word for it.